So a quick word about myself. So I'm professor of strategy at HEC Montreal. I also am co-editor at Strategic Organization, as well as being an editorial board member at the Academy of Management Journal and the Academy of Management Review. And I'll just make a quick, plug-in for Strategic Organization to sort of underline the fact that we're very, very interested in qualitative research. And so any qualitative researcher, you may want to consider submitting any of your work to Strategic Organization, very developmental feedback, and so on. The paper today is very much focused on a paper that we co-wrote with a friend and co-author, Davide Ravasi, which we published in Strategic Organization in 2021, which was about the use of tables to enhance trustworthiness in qualitative research. And what we're going to present today here is actually parts of the paper that didn't make it in the published paper for space reasons. We had actually spent a lot of time looking at the way we can use tables for analysis over and above for trustworthiness purposes. And so some of that content that was taken out of the published paper is what I'm going to be presenting to you here today. So in this paper, one of the things that we did was to, again, this is not moving, I see. Here we are. Was to do a mini review of qualitative papers that were published in top journals to sort of look at how authors had actually used the different tables and what parts of the paper they were in. So for instance, were they in the methods section of the paper? Were they in the findings section? And also to sort of get a sense of what was the function of those tables? What were they accomplishing by including those tables in their paper? And this allowed us to sort of come up with a typology, if you like, of the most common types of tables that appear in published research that uses qualitative studies. Before we move beyond that, before I start detailing some of these different types of tables and how they might be used, perhaps just sort of a quick word on some misconceptions about tables. Especially since when we started writing this paper, there was a bit of a backlash around tables. Some of you may have followed in the literature. There was in many top journals a tendency for the JOA method. Some of you are familiar with some of the writings and even the videos. Davide has put out a couple of videos with regards to the JOA method, and it became kind of like viewed as a template. And there was a bit of pushback because the template came along with the use of tables, and some scholars felt that tables were reductionist, that they were also positivist, and sort of wanting to sort of push back and sort of say, well, in fact, we don't want to use tables because it sort of signals our epistemological and ontological positioning. And our argument was to sort of say, well, there isn't. I mean, tables themselves are neutral. And one of the reasons I think some people thought of it as positivist was largely because the reference for using tables in analysis was Miles and Huberman. It was the sort of most common reference that we use. And those scholars had actually positioned themselves as critical realist or objectivist or positivist, although the tables themselves actually didn't have any of those orientations. I mean, tables and the use of tables is a very neutral thing, and you can use it as much for doing qualitative research that might be more towards a positivist side of the spectrum, and if you're much more on the interpretive side, they could be used as well. And there's evidence of tables being used at both ends of those spectrums. The other assumption or misconception about tables is they're simply a device for communicating persuasively your findings. So they're just a display device as opposed to actually being an analytical device or a tool that you can use for analytical purposes. So putting those misconceptions aside, it allows me to sort of jump in and look at some of the different ways or the uses that tables have in the conduct of qualitative research. So there's three main uses that we've identified. One is you can use tables to organize data, you can use tables to analyze data, and of course you can use tables for displaying data. So if you're using tables, and this one I'll go over it fairly quickly, but I think it's an important one simply because when I look at students of qualitative research students, even sometimes in the papers that I get to review, you kind of wonder if the authors have done a good job at organizing their data. So tables can be a really effective way for keeping track of the data that you have, for keeping track of what is missing or incomplete in your data, and also for organizing your data by different possible criteria, by source, by case, by study, and so on. Increasingly, if those of you have paid attention to recently published qualitative work, you'll see that it's based on very large databases of data. People are collecting hundreds of interviews, thousands of documents. There has to be a way to organize that information in a way that is easily accessible. The other thing is because you're organizing, you're collecting such large amounts of data, it's likely that you're going to be writing several in papers or conducting several studies based on that large amount of data, and you want to have a way to access that information effectively and systematically. So a way to do that, and there are different tools out there. I mean, I simply use Excel, but there's other types of tools that might be useful, where you simply compile all of the data that you have in a systematic way, and that you qualify it along a variety of characteristics. It could be by organization, by case, by type of informant. If you're interviewing, for instance, top management teams, you might be interviewing middle managers, you might be interviewing employees, and maybe you want to look at a subset of that data. Well, you simply could have toggle switches on top of your Excel spreadsheet. It will then pull up all the relevant data, and that data could then be either downloaded into an Atlas TI or NVivo, and then you can sort of analyze that subsection of your data. If you need to compile or count how much information or how much types of data that you have in the different categories, you can do that very easily. And so developing this good habit of organizing your data using tables will save you a lot of grief, I think, in later stages of conducting your research, and will allow you to be much more systematic about it. I even mention this because just recently I reviewed a paper for Academy of Management Journal, and I mean, the authors had different numbers for the number of interviews that they conducted at different parts of the paper. So in one part of the paper, they conducted 100 and however many interviews. In another part of the paper, they're saying, oh, we conducted so many interviews, which is not the same number. And then yet later in the paper, yet another number for the number of interviews that they conducted. And my guess is that they were counting them at different times and weren't able to keep like a systematic track of what exactly they did and which interviews they used for that particular study. So this is where that becomes quite helpful. A second use, and this is the one where I'll spend the most time on, is using tables for analyzing data. And three main uses that Davide and I had identified for the use of tables for analytical purposes. One is that they're quite useful for validating the robustness of intuitive insights. And I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by that, or what we mean by that. It's useful for highlighting patterns across units of analysis. And I'm going to make a point of saying that you could be quite creative about your unit of analysis and experiment and explore different ways of framing or defining your unit of analysis, which will then reveal different kinds of insights. And it's also useful for keeping track of your data sources that you used for a particular study, the analytical steps that you followed, coding criteria, and so on. So let's dig into the first one, validating the robustness of intuitive insights. So when we're conducting qualitative research, initially you will have learned perhaps a grounded theory approach. You're going to look through your data. You may start analysis at various points in time. You may want to wait to accumulate a certain amount of interviews, a certain amount of documentary evidence, and you're going to start looking through it, not necessarily committing to anything specific. You may have a research question in mind. You may have done some preliminary literature review. You've designed your study accordingly to sort of address that question, but you're still in a relatively open stance. You're reading through your data, maybe taking some notes in the margins, and letting some potential interesting insights emerge from that initial, I guess you could call it initial coding of your data. but there's no real commitments going on at this stage. You're just kind of exploring what might be interesting here. So in this paper that we published in 2020 with Davide on the identity trajectories of 4 nonprofits, that really started from a conversation. The data itself was data from my PhD. So when I did my PhD, I had conducted an initial data collection around these 4 nonprofits. It was not an identity paper at the time. At least I didn't conduct it as an identity study. And we were having these conversations about the content of those interviews and those organizations. And at some point he had said, well, this really sounds like an identity story. So we're like, okay, well, let's go have a look at the data to see whether that intuition, that insight that we had actually is present in the data. And so one of the first things we did was to have a look at the identity claims that these 4 organizations said about themselves when they were describing who they were as an organization. How was that articulated in various types of data? And here there's an effort at triangulating. So it's not like one unique source. We sort of said, okay, let's have a look at what this looks like in the formal documentation of the organization. Let's have a look at what it looks like in the materials that they communicate with, their newsletters, their website, their annual reports, for instance. What kind of claims are they making about themselves? We also had a look at how they were presenting themselves or their identity claims in their other types of documents, like proposals to funders or reports to the government and so forth. How were they describing themselves? How did they articulate who they were? And we also analyzed or checked what those claims were in the interviews that we conducted with those informants. And so this was a way for us to sort of get a really robust sense of what those claims were across these types of different sources as a kind of triangulation to verify whether we were onto something, and also to convince our readers that these were indeed the claims. These were indeed how these organizations identified themselves. Likewise, we conducted a grounded analysis. So, something many of you have done. You might be in NVivo or Atlas, or you may do it manually, and you start coding your data. And some initial categories of code start to emerge as potentially interesting. In our case, once we'd sort of set out what those claims were, we started to look at interesting concepts that emerged through this grounded analysis, a concept we called identity enforcement, identity enactment. And then it became a task to use a table which resembled this one. This is a working table, by the way. This is not a table that shows up in any of any paper. This is just a working table that we developed to go and check again to validate that intuitive insight that seems like an interesting concept. They engage in practices to enforce their identity in various ways. And then it was a question of figuring out what evidence did we have of that across the cases, across the 4 cases. And we wanted to look for multiple sources. So it had to come from a variety of informants. It couldn't have been just one person who said that. It had to be multiple persons who said it, perhaps in different ways, but was evidence of this construct that we called identity enforcement. We also wanted to see whether it was present in other data sources, like in documents or in observation notes or field notes. And so this was a way also to check and see and verify whether this intuition that we had wasn't just something that popped up or an anecdote that someone said and we just kind of latched onto, but was actually something that was present in all 4 of those cases. And these tables, just by the way, they're huge. I mean, I've synthesized the structure of the table here, but this table, once we'd completed it, it could be 20, 30 pages long. I mean, it was just a question of plugging in the data as a way of validating or checking if our insights actually were sustained by the data. And here's another example. Oops. Here we are. So here's another example of a more recent paper that was just recently published in AMJ. And this is a study where we're looking at how organizations it's actually how trade associations come to agree on practice change standards for the industry. And it was I would say, at least part of the study, not all of it, and you'll see some examples as we move forward. Part of the study involved a more JOA-like analysis with first order, second order, and aggregate themes. And one working table that we had, and it took a certain amount of time, was to settle on what those constructs were, and then to collect all of the evidence that was representative of that particular second order and first order codes. And to do that in a systematic and complete way. So again, this would be a table that might be 20, 30 pages long, in which we collect all the best data that we have that provides evidence for those constructs. And once we have this full table, if you like, with all that information that's contained in it, then we'd go into the process of identifying specific data fragments or quotes or citations or whatever, because that could be a combination of documentary evidence, it could be extracts from interviews, it could be extracts from field notes, it doesn't matter. It's just an ensemble of data fragments that provide evidence for that construct. And then we would pick them. And this is a Davide technique, but I know others use it as well, where we might color code those extracts that we find the most representative of that construct. Mike Pratt will talk about power quotes. That might be a way for us to identify those, which ones go into the text, the actual findings of the paper, which ones we're going to mobilize in the paper, and then which ones will actually go into our evidence table. But what is in the evidence table is actually just a fraction of the full evidence that goes behind our what ends up being the concept evidence table that's published in the final version of the paper. So another way in which we can use tables to analyze data is to highlight patterns across units of analysis. So again, you have a hunch. And in our case, we had a bunch of emerging constructs. Say we're going back to the identity paper with Davide. We have a bunch of emerging constructs. We see that identity is a thing. Clearly there was something going on in these organizations. We tracked the claims. We had already done that work of figuring out what those claims were for the 4 organization, multiple data sources to confirm what those claims are. We've documented them throughout the history of the organization, and it became clear to us that they're kind of changing. Like these claims there's no radical change, because that was what was interesting to us, was like, these were pretty stable organizations that existed for long periods of time. But over time, those claims seemed to shift a little bit. There was a bit of a change in those claims. So we needed to start tracking what those changes were. And so we developed a table to be able to start tracking the claims as they evolved over time. And then the other constructs as well, because we wanted to sort of see whether there were practices or did the identity work change at different stages of the development of these organizations. And so we developed a table to be able to plug in data that allowed us to see that allowed us to sort of see or tracking how these identity claims evolved over time, and how did the practices related to those identity claims also changed over time. And again, this is a large table that contains a lot of evidence that then needs to be synthesized for display purposes. But this was initially possible. This is the only way that we could start seeing and documenting how the identity changed, and then what might explain that change. Here's another example of a table. This is a working table. In the end, we didn't use it, but we tried. That was part of the effort at analyzing our data, looking for insights. So this is the more recent paper that I mentioned that we published around trade associations looking to change their practices, industry level practices. And one of the early insights that we had with regards to this data was that we noticed there was a pattern around how tension could be productive or unproductive. So, these external events put pressure on the industry to improve their practices around sustainable development. And those usually triggered tension inside the organization. They were like, should we respond? Do we need to respond? We don't know. We agree, we don't agree. It's a threat, it's not a threat. And so we noticed that the tension levels that that occurred at different moments had impact both at different levels of the organization, and that those levels of tension, so both tension inside the organization, tension with specific stakeholders, and then wider tension resulting from wider social pressures. And we wanted to track that tension. So what events happened, what sorts of tensions were created by that, which we ended up calling it friction at some point. And we wanted to know how tensions at different levels impacted tensions at other levels. And so we drew up this table that tracked the events, and we had coded for tensions throughout. So our unit of analysis here were tensions that occurred at different levels of the organization. And we wanted to know, could we trace any kind of a pattern there between the tension as it evolves at different levels and how one level might influence another level? So this is what we tried to do here. We never used this in the end, but this was one attempt at trying to track what we called friction flows. We tried another way, since the first one didn't prove very conclusive, or at least we weren't able to trace any interesting patterns. And we tried another way in which we added a column where we showed the friction flows a bit differently. And then we added how the organization responded to those perceptions of the different tensions that we documented earlier. Here too, it didn't quite prove as productive as we'd hoped. It didn't reveal any interesting patterns. But it was part of the process of trying to pay attention and identify interesting patterns around this hunch that we had that the management of tension in this organization had implications for the likelihood that they would agree to new practice terms, if you like, for the industry as a whole. Another working table that we then developed is we noticed that although we were not able to sort of document friction flows in an efficient and convincing way, we decided to focus on practices. So that was something that we noticed, is that they engage in particular kinds of practices that then served, that not deliberately so, but it seemed to increase or decrease the tension that they were feeling at that moment. Either it would amplify it or it would diminish it. And so then it became a task of identifying what those practices were at the different levels, at the different phases of the process that we'd also identified in a previous analysis. So we'd identified 3 phases, and then we needed to track the practices that it amplified or diminished tension at each of those stages. And so this, again, huge table with data in each of the boxes as an effort to try and track the patterns of practices that serve to diminish or amplify tensions. And of course, like I said, none of this is appearing in any of the papers once published. I mean, these are just working tables to help us look for and identify patterns. If we look at other papers, not our own, obviously I don't have the working tables, but here we have a paper by Michelle in which she's looking at bankers and how over time the practices that serve to initially deny their bodily reactions to overwork. And so she tracks over time using a whole bunch of indicators that she's argued in her paper as being important indicators of how and when these bankers are socialized into denying their bodily symptoms associated with fatigue. And so this is a case of overworked bankers that have pain or have health issues which they deny for the purpose of saying that work should dominate and we should overcome and so on. And she tracks how that evolves over time, how initially there's full denial and then progressively refusal to be socialized into this culture of denying physical pain associated with work. And so that's another way in which you can analyze your data to look for interesting and potentially interesting patterns. Here's another table that could be helpful as well. This is Croutzen and Johan Croutzen's and Percy Hugin's study of the craft brewing in the Dutch beer industry. And here they're looking at the reemergence of craft and how it is and helps trigger institutional change. And it produces 2 types of logics for the production of craft brewing. And one of the initial things they needed to show or demonstrate is to literally track those 2 logics to sort of see what do they look like and how different are they, identifying what the characteristics are and then documenting them systematically to be able to do this comparison. Now, behind each of those claims, there is data. It's not just them putting out these statements. There is data behind it, but by presenting it in this way, the contrast becomes clear. Another way, again, that we, this is also a final table. This table is what appeared in the paper, but we did have to develop it to be able to show our different trajectories. And again, here we were able to look at two, in the end, like we said, we tracked how the identity claims evolved over time. We tracked the reasons for that evolution, the identity work, how that was different in two cases, the identity work played out in a particular way. In the two cases, the identity work played out in a different way. And then we were able to contrast it to literally show exactly how those two trajectories played out and why that was that they played out the way they did as a consequence of the different kinds of identity work that they did on the two pathways. And here too, the table really allows to highlight those contrasts. Here's Eisenhardt's 1989 study on fast decision making. And here again, if you're looking to show emerging patterns, to show emerging patterns, she has her 8 cases of these software companies analyzing how the managers make decisions, and then there's a ranking here based on the number of alternatives that they consider when making decisions, and qualifying those as whether those are decisions that were considered simultaneously or whether these were decisions that were considered sequentially. And by placing them here, ranking them, in fact, by number of alternatives and whether these alternatives were considered simultaneously or sequentially, shows a clear pattern in terms of the fast decision-making or slow decision-making processes of these organizations. Multiple case studies is something, if you are doing multiple case studies, and your case doesn't have to be an organization. A case could be an event. A case could be a person. A case could be an incident. A case could be a moment of tension or a moment of anger. You choose your unit of analysis. Once you have it, then you can sort of figure out ways to organize them, rank them in different ways, present them as contrasts or as rankings, and so on. And that will allow potentially to see some interesting patterns emerge. Here's another Eisenhardt study, this time 4 cases. As opposed to the cases, you can have them across the top, you can have them on the side, it doesn't matter. Whatever works for you and whatever allows you to see your data in a succinct way so that these patterns can come out clearly. Here again, we're looking at effectiveness of board relations, and they're ranked from low to moderate to high effectiveness, with characteristics that explain that ranking in a single table so that then we can look at these patterns or see them more clearly than if you're looking at your raw data. Another cross-case comparison, so not organizations in this case. This is Jennifer Howard Grenville's study of issue selling in a microchip factory. And her unit of analysis in this case are the projects, so individual projects pursued by different subgroups within the organization. And here you're tracking, according to various indicators, the presence or non-presence to judge whether this was a successful or a failure project, whether the managers had successfully sold their projects to top management or not, along a series of criteria, which are qualitatively assessed. And she has a column with outcomes, so you can clearly see which of these projects they managed to successfully sell the issue at stake here or not. And then she goes on to theorize about this. But this presentation really allows us to see the patterns in the success and failure of the different projects. Here's a working table paper that I'm working on now. It's a bit of a mess. It still is a mess because it's very much a working table. In this case, our unit of analysis are strategic objectives of an organization. There are 8 of them. They're shown across the top. And then we identified a bunch of indicators. Some of them are drawn from the data. They emerged clearly from our analysis of the data. Some of them are theoretically derived from prior studies as being meaningful for assessing attention, managerial attention to strategic objectives. And then we went in and tried to fill in all the slots to get a sense of whether which objectives had more or less attention over time. And it's a combination of quant and qual characteristics that help us assess the amount of attention that was given to the different strategic objectives over time. So this is a working table. It's kind of a mess. I don't know what it's going to look like in the final version because it's a paper that we're actually working on now. And the final use, and I'll take a pause after this to take a few questions. The final use in terms of analyzing data is really keeping track of the data sources that you used for a study, the analytical steps that you followed, the coding criteria that you used. And it's kind of like good hygiene in a way, mainly because it's really hard to reconstruct if you only do it after the fact. So if you are actually tracking what you're doing as you do it, then when you come to write your methods section of your paper, it's a very simple thing. There's none of this trying to remember what you did, when you did it, who did what, and so on. If you document it systematically in a table, then you'll be able to reconstruct the process that you followed more quickly and with more accuracy. Data sources. So this is the data sources table that we put together for the identity study. We have presented all the different type of data that we collected for each case across the top. The data sources are along the left-hand column. And then we also have a right-hand column where we have use in the analysis, how this data was actually used in our analysis. So oftentimes when I review papers, I see people that just simply give us all the data that they have. They did not use all that data in that specific study. And it's okay to sort of signal that you have more data than you're actually using. And several authors will do that. If you pay attention to method sections of papers, they will say, this is part of a larger study in which we collected all of this data, but for this specific study, this is the data that we use. Here's a subset of the data that we used, and this is how we used it in the analysis. Now, some of it might just be contextual information, and that's important. You want to show that you have a deep understanding of your context, but it doesn't mean that you used all that data specifically for the specific study that you are conducting and what you're writing about. And it becomes relevant then to have a table that shows specifically the data that you use for the very specific study that you are trying to write about and publish. It's also for your coding scheme. This becomes interesting as well, especially if there's many authors. You want to keep a very systematic track of how you're defining certain constructs and how you're identifying them in the data. And that is also a way in which you can show to your reviewers and your editor that this is not random. Like there's some clear thought that was put into how you define a particular construct. And here, for example, we're showing four core constructs that we identified that were significant for our study, and then how that then manifested itself in the data. This is also a sense of this is also part of trustworthiness, but it's also keeping us aligned and ensuring that all the authors in a study are actually have the same shared understanding of how this new code has evolved. It's not a question of validating or intercoder reliability. It's just understanding amongst ourselves this concept as we've coded our data, as we've worked and analyzed it more and more. We're refining the definitions and agreeing on what exactly that is and making that very clear to our readers and audience. And final example, in terms of your analytical steps, you can see that method sections are really getting quite long. Some people complain that they're very boring to read. They're very important, though, because that is also part of convincing your audience that you did find what you found, and you've come to these logical conclusions that make sense. And sometimes you can save some space and be a little bit more precise about what you did if you keep track of it in a table. So here is a table that appeared in a highly cited study by Wendy Smith around paradox. And she really identifies very, very clearly and nicely exactly what she did. That it's not a generic methods section. Oh, we coded the data, we organized them in second order themes and in aggregate themes. And you could, a method section that can apply to any paper. Usually reviewers don't like that. They want to know exactly what you did. And this is a way to show that. But it's also a way to keep track of what you did, why you did what you did, and then show a little bit how you got from one stage to the next stage to arrive at the conclusions that you make. Okay, why don't I take a pause? And I don't know if there's any questions. I didn't see any hands, so I'm just going ahead.
Yeah, if you have any questions, just feel free to raise your virtual hand so we can see you. Or you can just unmute yourself and shoot your question. Thelma? Thelma, did you want to ask your question?
Hi, yes. Good afternoon. My name is Thelma, and I'm sorry, I just keep getting calls that are disturbing me. And I apologize for the noisy background, just my kids behind. Oh. Can we call Daddy on the phone? Can you guys
Would it be easier, Thelma, if you write the question in the chat, and then Ibrat will share it with me when you're ready? Are there other questions, or is this so clear that I just can plow ahead? Kristen.
So I have a question about when using these tables, how do you adjust, if at all, the coverage that you give to the data in text? So I know with lots of qualitative, you'll work, kind of work the examples, work the quotations from participants. Do you do less of that when you have it in tables?
It really depends. I mean, sometimes we'll use table and it's just an extract of, it could be very long extracts. I mean, in some cases, you manage to have fairly short extracts that are representative of a construct that sounds interesting. Sometimes it could be quite long, an entire paragraph, 2 paragraphs, if that makes sense. I mean, sometimes we might want to synthesize it just to be able to see things. I've also used them, for instance, I mean, even in our more recent paper, there are very long narratives. There's 2 long, we talk about 2 trajectories. The narratives are quite long. And we didn't want to be too reductive in the way that we showed the evolution and the dynamics that were going on at the various stages. And so we had these very long tables that allowed us to be very consistent about who said what when, what events or activities were going on. And it wasn't just quotes or citations. It was also narrative, us describing what was going on. I mean, I was at these meetings and, I could write out exactly what went down in those particular meetings in a more narrative style. But it allowed it to be very consistent, to sort of be sure that everything is organized chronologically and that I'm not using excerpts, field notes, observations, and everything from the wrong period for the period that I'm describing in the long narrative in text. And so there's no real limitation, I think. You decide what excerpts make sense. It is partly reductionist, but not in a negative sense. It's more about trying to look for patterns. I mean, when you're looking at something as an extremely long narrative, at some point in time, it's really hard to see those patterns. So you sort of have to figure out ways to present aspects of your data, whether it's you who synthesizes what's going on in a kind of narrative. It's not necessarily excerpts. You're putting in your own description of what went on at a certain time, allows you just to sort of see what is happening at a larger scale than you might be able to do it with raw data alone. So I would encourage you to be very creative about what those data fragments are. I think sometimes we say quotes, and it's not just quotes. It's really, I think data fragments are the better use of the term. And that fragment could be field notes, it could be your own synthesis of what's going on, it could be excerpts, if that makes sense. And by playing around with these things, you may start seeing some interesting patterns emerging. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think that's good for now, and I might have more follow-up questions later.
Okay, great. Samar?
Yeah, thank you, Charlotte. That's very, very useful. I'm fond of tables myself. I've faced few challenges, and I think those are kinds of ongoing. I would like to ask two things in here. What would you advise for the large tables? And one of the examples you showed that was over 30 pages. For journal publications, editors won't be very positive. At least in my experience, that won't be positive if our tables are too long. And the second thing I would like to ask is, before we actually reach to that stage where we have a comprehensive table, how, what challenges have you faced and how do you overcome those challenges? So out of hundreds of pages of the narratives, compressing that into a table form is not an easy job.
Oh, I'm not suggesting that any of this is easy. So I'll answer both questions. The first one is the working tables in the identity, for the identity paper, we had working tables that were 100 pages long. Those tables don't go, you don't submit that to a journal that's just your working tables. That's just the tools that you have to help you make sense of this data. Some people will use a software like NVivo to do part of the work, that allows them to start, synthesizing, reducing, and then cut and pasting into tables. And it's a very progressive thing, the 100 tables, you say, okay, what's the most, can I reduce this a bit? I'll take this out, take that out, I'll focus on this. And then you have a slightly more reduced table and then a slightly more reduced one until you come up with something that's a fairly accurate synthesis of the whole. But you don't go from 100 pages to 1 page. I mean, it takes multiple steps, lots of discussions. That's helpful when you have multiple authors to figure out, okay, what's going on here? What's the most important thing that's going on here that makes sense, to help me understand what's going on. And maybe just building on Kristen's remarks, sometimes we use tables that never show up in the paper. And in fact, there are no tables at all in the paper, the final published version of the paper. We just use the tables as a tool to help us make sense of what's going on. And then in the end, what ends up being shown in the paper is this rich narrative explaining the circumstances. But that narrative, you would have found it very hard to produce, or may have found it hard to produce without first organizing your data in some working table that helped you make sense of what's going on, so you can then tell the story you want to tell in your paper. If it's more of an ethnographic account, for example, you don't have to. I mean, you don't have to have tables in the final version of your paper. That's what we're arguing, is that in some cases that might make sense. In some cases, it may not. And we should really see them as tools. But no, do not send a 12-page table to the journal, because they're going to freak out. That's for sure. Like, you need to, if you're going to include one in there, it does have to be fairly synthetic. And Miles and Huberman, I mean, for their advice, if you want to hold on to it, I mean, and this is something that Davide and I have talked a lot, and not always in agreement. They say that you should try to always make it 1 page. Like, if you want to see patterns, it has to be, and it could be a very big, like you can do it on a poster if that helps, but they'll say it's 1 big table, because that's what's going to allow you to see the patterns. We're kind of limited to an 8.5 by 11, but nothing prevents you from, I don't know, do like a big poster thing and then start putting data in all these sections and see if some interesting patterns emerge that way. So it's really to be creative about how you use the tables to help you understand. And then the display work, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, that's like a separate task. That's a different thing. Like, once you've got your analysis done, then you can start thinking about, okay, how do I show this for my audiences to convince them about what I found? But I see that as two separate or different processes. And maybe the last point with regards to that, as I have seen this more and more, is that the concept evidence tables, like those long tables with all the evidence, that increasingly is showing up in appendices. So many journals now are not including those in the main paper. They're putting that as supplements. So that's where the extra evidence is being provided. And in some cases, once the reviewers have seen that evidence, they don't feel a need to include it in the actual paper. So sometimes you'll see papers that have like a data structure, but they don't have evidence tables. That doesn't mean that they didn't show any or provide any to the reviewers in the review process. So that's also something to keep in mind. But I am seeing it often now as supplements, so that you don't have like a 2-page table in the main body of the text. That's something that people who really want to check can check it as in the appendix. Natalia.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Charlotte. And I think my question will be a little bit like follow up what you were just telling about. And it's about, is there something like I think to use too many tables, or how to balance amount of tables and to display? It might be, I think you will go into talk in the future, the next part of the presentation.
So I just missed the first part. You were saying how many? Is that your question?
Yeah. No, my question is if there is something like to use too much tables and how to balance them. Yeah, maybe how.
Oh, in analysis, there's no limit. I mean, we kept coming up with new ideas we tried all kinds of different things, and that's part of the analytical process. Try out, organize, you put your cases across the top, on the side, look at them chronologically, look at them typologically, look at them by case, look at them by informant. I mean, there's all kinds of ways in which you can organize any number of tables that helps you understand what is going on here. Why is this happening the way it does? Like, we're looking for explanations about things. You have hunches about what might be interesting or counterintuitive. You got to follow those hunches and check them in the data to sort of see, this is actually going on in an interesting way, and it's different in these cases, and it's the same in those cases, and why is that difference, and where does that come from? So no limit to the number of working tables that you can generate to help you understand. In a typical paper, though, then you have to be a little bit more judicious and careful about what you include, because you don't have that much space. So you want to sort of be very selective about the tables that are included. I mean, usually you should have a data sources and use table. I think that's even in ethnographic type papers where everything is narrative. You will see, at least in good journals, you will see a little table that synthesizes what the person did, what they collected the data, and how much data. And that, I think, is a really strong signal to reviewers and readers about the rigor of the work, the extent of the data upon which the study relies, and so on. So that's kind of an almost necessary table to include. And then it's your choice, right? I would encourage you to look at the target publication and to get a sense of, on average, is this a table-heavy paper, like journal, where most of the papers have a lot of tables? That seems to signal that that's what the editors and reviewers like. And other journals where you can see there's a lot more variability, so you have more room to maneuver, and maybe just a couple of tables or no tables. That really is a personal choice. I don't think there's any recipe for that. I think looking at the different journals and thinking to yourself, is this table necessary? I mean, is it helping? You don't put them there for the sake of putting them there. They all have to have a purpose and a use. And keep asking yourself, well, is this good use? Is this helping? Is it helping my argument? Is it reinforcing my argument, or is it just a distraction? If it's a distraction, take it out. There's no point that it should be in the paper. Okay.
Thank you.
So let's move on. I guess we can move on a bit, and then there'll be more questions as we go forward. Okay, so we talked about analyzing and gave a bunch of examples of definitely non-exhaustive list of ways in which you can use different kinds of tables to look for patterns, to confirm insights, and so on. In terms of displaying, tables are also useful in different ways for displaying your data. So again, this is what shows up in the final version of your paper, whatever you submit to a journal. So 3 things in which tables can be useful for display purposes. Well, obviously showing the evidence that you have in support of your claims. Synthesizing your cases, and again, I insist, a case is not just an organization. A case, it's really a unit of analysis, which could be a whole bunch of things, and it helps to be creative about what is your unit of analysis. It can synthesize a narrative as well, and it could be helpful for synthesizing theory, especially if the theory has many moving parts and constructs, and it just helps provide kind of a snapshot of all those elements in a single page to reinforce your reader's understanding. So, showing data for display purposes, so showing evidence in support of your claims. This is pretty straightforward, and so I won't spend too much time on this. Here's the example of the data structure that we had for our trade association paper. In here, we simply, show what the first order codes are, what the second order codes are, the aggregate themes. This gives the readers confidence that the analysis using this approach, and by no means the only approach. We're certainly, I've used, as you can see from the other papers, we don't always use a data structure as a method of analysis. It made sense here for the practices that we were documenting, but it wasn't the only an analytical tool that we used. So this is a way to show that. And the final table, I had showed you the early one where all the data, like the 100 pages or the 30 pages and so forth, this one is where we've actually selected things out. And we've picked the best data fragments to include as illustrations of the first and second order codes. This is a table that actually didn't make it in the main paper. It ends up in the appendix. So this is an example, like I mentioned, where the data structure is in the main paper, but the evidence that supports the data structure is actually as part of the appendix. So those are the sort of very standard display ways of showing, here is the evidence that I have in support of my claims. Tables can also be useful for synthesizing your cases, as well as possibly synthesizing a complex narrative. So for cases, again, pretty straightforward. Almost any study that is a multiple case study or a 1 or 2 case study is going to have a table that shows a snapshot of the content or information about the different cases. So here is Tiona Zuzul's study of 2 smart cities. We're comparing 2 cases, Smart Town and Smart Block, a bunch of characteristics that then describe the 2 cases and show to readers, reviewers, the comparability. Are these comparable cases? Are they the same or different? So you want to kind of show in an easy to see format information about the 2 cases, the synthesized information about the 2 cases that demonstrates or shows their reliability, their comparability. So here's another one with more cases. This is another Eisenhardt study. We have 5 cases here and various elements that describe the cases, again, to confirm their comparability. And in this case, we have a combined table, something that we don't necessarily encourage unless there's a real point to do that, where we also, in this case, they extended the table to include their data sources. So for each of those cases, here's the amount of data that we have. And again, for comparison purposes. Do we have similar amounts of data for each of the cases that we document? So I do see this sometimes where we have a multiple case study, 3, 4 cases, lots of data for 1 or 2 cases, very little data for the 2 others. That looks a bit lopsided, and that will raise alarms with reviewers to sort of say, well, you didn't have quite the same amount of data for the 4 cases. Are these truly comparable? So another way in which you can present or synthesize case summaries. Another practice, this is a favorite of Davide's. He likes to use this table. He calls it a narrative summary. And this is a table in which, in this case, you're presenting it, you can present it in many different ways. Here, they're presenting it in terms of phases, core constructs, and how those constructs manifested themselves over time. And what is contained in each of the cells is a narrative summary of the findings. So just a short extract. These are not data fragments. These are literally the authors who wrote them, their narrative summary of what goes on, presented in a table format. If you have a long, complex story, this is sort of the story at a glance. If you want to get the short gist of what's going on across time, give people that sense of the overall in a single page, this could be a useful method and tool. And finally, tables can be helpful for synthesizing theory. So here is, again, because we had a fairly complex story in this paper, we were looking at two trajectories in which the identity claims of organizations, two organizations followed a trajectory, two followed a trajectory, different explanations, different practices along both trajectories. This table made it easy for our readers to grasp the content and the analysis that we did that explains the two trajectories. So the same kind of claims, you can see that the same categories of constructs on the left-hand side, and then how they played out in cases in the trajectory 1 and in trajectory 2. And it's sort of an at a glance, this is our theory, here are the constructs, here's how they play out in the two trajectories. We also did this in our more recent paper that was published in AMJ, again, because we had so many constructs. We wanted to be clear so that the readers could literally see, here are the different constructs, here are the definitions, here are how they play out. And then it made it much easier for the readers to understand our model. So these two kind of go together. Every construct that's here shows up in the model. And it's easy for readers who look at our model to say, okay, that's what that is, that's what that is, this is the role it plays, this is the function, this is the relationship between this and this. And it's a kind of way of providing a summary of the theory that you're putting forward in a paper. Again, it's a choice. Not all papers will have these, but they turn out to be quite useful tools in terms of persuading and convincing your reviewers and your readers eventually about the claims that you're making. Any more questions? And then I'll just sort of look at a little bit about some design tips for tables. Okay, so I'll continue. The thing to think about as well in being creative, so I talked about being creative about the rows, about the columns that you develop for generating your tables and playing around with your data in different ways. And I'm sort of we like to encourage people to also think creatively about what goes in the cells. So what can you put in a cell? So typically, of course, text excerpts, data fragments of any kind, and it could be direct quotes, field notes, tweets, whatever it is that you're studying. There could be raw data that goes into your cells. It could be images. It doesn't have to be text. It could also be images. So you can put raw data into those cells, but it doesn't have to just be raw data. It could be processed data as well. It could be a narrative summary, your synthesis of what's going on that makes sense within that cell. You can put numbers, of course you can put numbers. You can put descriptive codes that you've developed, a code system. It could be acronyms, abbreviations, whatever works for you, whatever makes sense. Symbols, I've shown you tick marks. We've used icons, full half circle, flags, whatever, again, makes sense for your analysis. You could have evaluations, as in the case with Jennifer Howard Grenville's table, where there's failure or success, weak, strong, high, low, plus, whatever it is that might gauge intensity or height or scale or amount of time spent on something. It doesn't really matter. You could find different ways of representing different kinds of evaluations, and you can do figures. Your own figures or drawings that represent what you've seen. And I'll give you some examples. So here is Massa and Felipe Massa and Siobhan O'Mahony, who are using a symbol, which is their circle, a full circle, a half circle, a quarter circle, and a no circle to represent level of adoption. So full adoption, partial adoption, minimal adoption. And by showing it in a table format over time, these patterns start to emerge. So it's a synthetic way of representing a construct or an evaluation of what's important to them in terms of adoption versus partial or minimal adoption. Showing it in a table then allows these patterns to come out more clearly than they would, say, in a narrative form. Here's an extract from a study by Amit Nigam and Gina Doco, in which they're using their own figures. So they've generated these figures and now they're presenting it in a table to make it easy for their readers to contrast and compare different kinds of trajectories or pathways that they're trying to theorize about. So again, what goes into the cells here is a drawing or a figure drawn by the authors, which represents their synthesis of their data. And here's a study from Davide, Violina Rindova, and Iliana Stigliani, in which they're using images as part of the data that they're presenting in their tables that then helps make much more evocative the story that they're telling. So feel free to include any kind of, be creative about what you put in the cells that help you understand what's going on and helps you show the claims or that you're trying to make. Okay, so I'll finish with a few tips for designing your tables. So think carefully about the content. So ask yourself, what is the information I want to focus on? Why does it make sense to focus on this? And again, do I need all these columns? So this is in the interest of trying to be parsimonious and not trying to do a table that does everything. So this is sort of our second tip, is to sort of think in terms of multiple tables as opposed to one table in which you put everything in there. I have seen some students, sometimes they love Excel. One of the reasons why I personally, and I think Davide is the same, we're not so crazy about Excel other than for me in the case of a data inventory, is that it kind of quickly becomes unreadable. You can fill in these cells and they bleed and it's just really hard to read. I don't know, I mean, everybody is different, but I find them very hard to read when we use Excel as a table. But if we use sort of a word table or even sometimes, like I said, a big poster on the wall, it allows us to see things better. But sometimes people create these tables that do everything, there's everything in there, and then that becomes difficult to see patterns. So it's better to think carefully about a table, think about what you put on the horizontal row, on the vertical row, what you put inside as content, give it a shot, fill it up, and then have a look. Not informed. Like I showed you some tables that we played around with, and in the end, we're like, not working for us. So toss that, try something new, and keep doing that until you come up with something that starts to show some interesting patterns. So yeah, try to do more tables as opposed to big complex ones. And use your imagination to highlight the patterns, use shading, try to focus on the comparisons, are they similar this way, different that way? Where is the element of difference? Use colors, use changing fonts to sort of help you focus on certain things, use maybe bold or something like that. Just again, playing around to help those patterns show up as you literally see them visually show up on your table. The fact that you have less flexibility with Excel in that sense, perhaps, is why maybe using other formats, RTF formats or Word documents allow you to play around with different ways of making those patterns shine or show up more clearly. So when it comes to displaying also, as much as I think working tables, you can sort of get away with the lack of clarity because it's only for you and you know what you're doing. But when you start showing tables for display purposes, they should be self-explanatory. Someone who looks at the table should understand immediately what is going on here. If the tables will play against you if a reader looks at them and doesn't understand what's there. What is this data that's in there? What is this table trying to do? What is it trying to show? If they have to ask themselves that question, the table should probably not be in the paper. You can have legends. We've tried that with legends. They should be relatively short. Big legends tend to throw reviewers off, so you might want to have a legend, but keep it succinct, keep the symbols down to a minimum so that the table itself is easy to understand. Space. Again, this is also a design element, mostly for display purposes. Do not pack your cells in with too much data. They visually have to be pleasing to look at, easy to read. Think about the margins, the cell margins. Think about the width of your columns. Try to keep a sort of symmetry and a visual kind of aesthetic to the table, because that will contribute to making it easy to read and easy to understand. And of course, pay attention to the guidelines. Some people don't spend enough time reading the author guidelines of different journals. It's actually important to sort of look at previous publications in the journals, look at how the tables are presented, look at the number of tables, like I said, and sort of follow that cue in terms of the tables that you include in a specific submission. And as much as you can use things like bold, italics, colors and everything like that for purposes of analysis that helps you see things, you're going to have to be very parsimonious about doing that when it comes to your display tables. Display tables should be as parsimonious, clean, and easy to read as you can make them. So just keep those in mind. Okay, and that's all I have to say for looking at the use of tables in qualitative research. And I'm available for questions if there are any.
Thank you, Charlotte. Just as a reminder, if you have a question, can you please raise your virtual hand so we can see you, and we'll call you. Or you can just turn on your microphone and ask your question.
Hey, Mariana.
Mariana, did you want to ask a question?
Okay, well, maybe we can take Natalia's question and then Mariana can jump in.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Thank you so much for this presentation. Very useful. I also like to use tables a lot, but sometimes I'm overwhelmed, right? So there are tables in text, and then maybe I'm tempted to put something in the appendix as well. So do you have, like, my first question, do you have a suggestion how many tables to put in the main text?
I mean, I've seen, like, because we did this kind of review of recent papers that use tables in a selection of good journals. It's anywhere between 3 and 5, I would say, is the average. I don't think again, there are exceptions, so there's no rules out there, but I think your best bet is to sort of look at the last 2-3 years of, like, you're targeting a journal, have a look at the last 2-3 years of, just flip through the publications you see there, qualitative content, and have a look to see, oh, look here, you know, it's 2 or 3. I think on average it's 3 to 5 with some exceptions. And then see, the other thing is eventually you can have more. I think if you go through the review process, sometimes they kind of let you throw in some, for instance, Paolo Aversa, I think he presented here, he has a paper on mountain climbing. And if you look at the appendix, I think there's like 10 or 12 tables in his appendix. And in the end, they kind of put it in there because as part of the review process, they had to keep producing more and more evidence to sort of convince the reviewers. And in the end, they sort of said, well, you know, we did all this work, so may as well include it in the appendix. But I don't think you can get away with a big bunch of tables in an initial submission, because reviewers may not even get that appendix, right? They're not going to get that additional submission, anything. So you have to be very selective in terms of which tables you include in that initial submission. And I think beyond 5, you have to have very good reasons for them to be in there, because reviewers are kind of going to say, like, you're bombarding me with information here. And the table is support. That's another thing that's important. The table, you cannot count on your reviewers to look carefully at a table for purposes of understanding what's going on. The text has to be your text, your description, your findings have to stand on their own. The tables are there as supplementary evidence in support of your claims. They do not carry the claims. Everything has to be in the text, because remember, when you submit, just about every journal, hopefully they'll change that at some point, but they're still asking you, insert table here, insert table there. And oftentimes reviewers are going to read the text. They may not even look at the tables. If they do, they look at the very end, and they only do it to check or validate. It means that they like your argument. So if they're going with your argument and they think it's a good argument, then they might check the tables. But I know now that I've done a lot of reviewing and that I'm even editing myself now, I realize how many reviewers do not look at those tables. Unless it's the very end of the process, or they're already convinced by the argument and they just want to check things. But if you're relying on your reviewers to look at your table to be convinced of an argument, you are missing out. Like, there is a chance they will not look at it. So especially for that initial submission, be very, very parsimonious, be very thoughtful about which tables you include. And then you'll have some room to maneuver. If you're invited for an R&R, then you can start piling it in. I've thrown tables into my response letters where I'm like, this is not going in the paper, but here we did this work, and this shows you that the reason we didn't do this is for this reason, right? So you have a bit more room to maneuver when you're in the review process. But for that first initial submission, I think you need to be very parsimonious and very careful about the choices you make.
And if I may, I just want to ask the second question very quickly. For the initial submission, would you suggest to attach a list of interview questions in the appendix in the initial submission of the paper?
I have mixed feelings about that, and different authors will have different opinions. Personally, I don't think that an editor or reviewer will refuse a paper because you didn't include the interview protocol. They might ask for it, in which case you can provide it. So it's your choice. Are you going to use up space for that? Personally, I wouldn't. I would wait for them to ask, unless for some reason that protocol is so unique or so particular to that study that it makes sense. It adds value to your argument. It makes it all the more convincing. But unless there's a very specific reason why that protocol, because in qualitative research, no protocol is fixed, right? It's an evolving thing, especially if we're doing conversational interviews. It's a guide, and it evolves over time. And if it doesn't evolve over time, we're not really doing our work the way we should in terms of interpretive research. So I would provide it only if they ask.
Yes,
I rarely would. I have never seen, so far, and again, touch wood, and there may be exceptions, but I'd be very surprised that a paper would be refused on the basis that you haven't included your interview protocol.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you.
Charlotte, there was Mariana raised her hand earlier, but she put her question in the chat. I'm just going to read it out.
Okay.
In the field of management research, we often face the challenge of representing complex and dynamic concepts through graphs and diagrams. What are your recommendations for balancing accuracy and simplicity in these visual elements, particularly when representing strategic processes or changes in a specific sector?
Wow, I wish I had an easy answer to that. I think it's trial and error. In this recent paper, we recently presented this recent paper we published in AMJ with Fanny Couture, my co-author. And at one point, we wanted to produce a GIF with every version of the tables and diagrams that we produced for this paper. The diagrams, we must have gone through, I would say, 100 iterations of that diagram to try and figure out a very parsimonious way of showing our claims, the relationship between our constructs in a synthetic, easy to understand way. We showed it to our colleagues. We were testing it. Her husband happens to be a graphic designer. We showed it to him. We were calling upon infographics. I have books here on infographics to try and look at, how do we convey information visually effectively? And I think those principles apply as much to tables as to display, to figures. We're often stuck with the very limited visual graphics tools at our disposal with Word or PowerPoint. Actually, PowerPoint's a little bit better. So in the end, we developed our graphs using PowerPoint, which we then took photos of and transformed into PNG documents to sort of make them clear and allow to do more in an 8.5 by 11 page than we could using traditional tools. So I don't have a recipe for that other than trial and error, to be honest. I think our theories are getting more complex, and that's a good thing. We're getting them, they're richer. We want to show more constructs, relationships between them, and it does require a kind of visual skill, I would say, an ability to use visuals to convey meaning. And it just is trial and error. I just keep using analogies and fiddling around until you come up with something that makes sense. And in our case, it took many, 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 many tries to arrive at something that is clear and easy to understand, that anyone looks at it and goes, oh yeah, I get it. And I guess we were vindicated because we showed this document to our informants, so the people that I've been talking to for the last 10 years, and they said they didn't even read the paper. They just looked at the figure and they were like, I get it. And we're like, okay, we actually pulled that one off, although it could have easily been a miss. But I'm sorry I can't provide a more helpful response to that, other than maybe we should have a codified system. Something we've talked about with Davide on a few occasions is to sort of figure out, maybe for qualitative research, there are some standardized kind of codes that we can put out there, just what certain things mean and how to represent them visually could be helpful for researchers grappling with that.
Charlotte, I feel
Okay.
this was a very clear session, very detailed, very clear. I'm not surprised on not many questions. But if there are any other questions before we wrap up, please feel free to go ahead and ask them. Arishka?
Thank you. Thank you, Yvette. Thank you, Charlotte. I came in late, so I'm terrified that I'm going to ask a question that was already covered. But I feel so frustrated with wanting to make beautiful, clear, parsimonious diagrams or figures, images, and then not knowing how. So I sense that I need a workshop or a weekend just to dedicate to doing this. And so I started playing
Good
with.
idea. This is something that Davide and I have talked about continuously for about 10 years now, and perhaps one day we'll do something.
That would be great. I was in a mini workshop at the PROS conference where Anne Langley said, okay, everyone show your figures without any words and have your seatmates explain it. And that helped a lot. Recently, I had a figure that's, I would say, a descriptive map. I was just laying it out, and the person helping to critique and develop me was like, arrows, you can't have arrows. Arrows mean this. You cannot have arrows.
Yeah.
So that there's these codes, and I'm doing qualitative research. They are qualitative senior scholar. So I'm learning that there is a kind of a visual vocabulary, and I'm learning what they are.
And the visual vocabulary is not codified or institutionalized. It's kind of what practice people have and the associations that they make. And occasionally, for instance, and it's the fact that we've also adopted certain practices from quant research, and we're kind of using them in qualitative when, in fact, they don't mean exactly the same thing. And I guess that was the argument that the discussion we had with Davide about, we borrow these constructs. Like Tufte has like a set of codified practices for quantitative representation, like the visual representation of quantitative data. That is a codified set of practices, and we've borrowed some of them, but they're not really fit for purpose in many ways. And I think the arrows is a good example. What do arrows do in a display or a visual representation of our data? Martha Feldman would sort of say, you need to theorize the arrows. So those arrows, when you're drawing those, what are they doing? Are they a process? Is that a circle that you're showing? Is it a dynamic that you're representing with that? And we haven't really codified that. So yeah, I think that might be helpful. This being said, if you look at some recent figures that are shown, they just make clear that every arrow is explained, right? So if you are drawing any kind of arrow, you're going to have like a subtitle or something there that literally explains what that arrow is doing. Like you won't take it for granted that people are going to assume the kind of relationship that you're tracing between these constructs. It's not a causal relationship, for instance. Like in quant, that arrow means something very specific. In qual, there's more room to maneuver, but you do need to sort of indicate the meaning of those relationships that you're tracing and how you trace them.
Thank you.
So we don't have but it is something we've certainly talked about, and maybe one day we'll sit down and come up with some kind of a codified system that is helpful for qualitative researchers.
I look forward to that. I have your guys' paper or pieces of the paper on the corkboard on the wall.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. But yeah, we do that exercise, the show your figure to someone and see if they understand it on its own. And I think that's something that all our students have found helpful. And I still find helpful to this day, where we show our figures and say, like, do you get this? I show it to, I don't know, my husband, who has no clue about, anything related to research. And if he gets it, then I'm like, okay, we're on the right track. And if they don't get it, then we need to rethink how we're showing our content. I think Wendy has she calls it her mom's statement. So Wendy Smith, when she was an associate editor at Academy of Management Journal, she often talked about this in lectures and talks and even in her letters. But even in her, she was an AE on one of the papers that we've worked on, and she even writes that in her letters. What's your mom's statement? Your mom's statement is, how do you explain your theory, your paper, your research in very easy to understand terms, such that your mother or a non-academic is able to understand? And I think we could say the same thing about our figures. Our figures, our tables, our mom's statement. Can we show our data, our claims, visually, our theories in a way that a non-expert is able to understand? And that helps us figure out whether we got it right or not.